Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this presentation. This is the first in what we hope will be several virtual discussions given the pandemic. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Rincon. I'm with the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. I'm a Foreign Service officer, and we're very pleased to welcome you here today. Please visit our website at adst.org to get more information about the work of ADST. Subscribe for our newsletter, which is published weekly. So we're pleased today to inaugurate the diplomatic lunch discussion. And we have with us today Keith Mines, who is a former diplomat himself and is currently a senior advisor for Colombia and Venezuela at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Keith joined USIP in December of 2019 after a long career in the State Department, where he was most recently the director for Andean and Venezuelan affairs. In 32 years of his diplomatic and military service, he worked on governance and institution building in Central America, on Middle East peace between Israelis and Palestinians, post-conflict stabilization in Haiti, Iraq, and Afghanistan, global financial stability and the environment with Brazil, NATO expansion with Hungary, the culture of lawfulness as the first director of the Merida Initiative in Mexico City, and famine relief and tribal reconciliation in Darfur and Somalia. So he has a career in some very interesting and very challenging places. Keith was educated at BYU. He got a BA in history, and he got an MS in Foreign Service from Georgetown University. He's a frequent contributor to publications such as the Foreign Service Journal and Orbis, and Mr. Mines has written extensively on post-conflict stabilization, measures short of war, and the roots of civil conflict. His forthcoming book, Why Nation Building Matters, Political Consolidation, Building Security Forces and Economic Development in Failed and Fragile States, is due out in August 2020 by the University of Nebraska Press. It gives us a great pleasure to have Keith join us, who will take over the presentation. Just wanted to remind everyone you're welcome to use the chat function to send questions throughout the presentation. We'll reserve some time at the end for questions and answers. So thank you very much for joining. Keith, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thanks a lot, Mark. So it's great to be with you today in this inaugural event, and I hope we can get off to a good start and have more of these. I think we're all kind of hungry for this kind of interaction. Let me present my slides here. So the genesis for this book came largely from my late friend Mike Sheehan, with whom I shared many of these adventures. And he thought that if somebody could put together the local context of how we got into these different situations, what happened afterwards, and how it turned out, that we might just have a book. The title started very cleverly as Boots on the Ground, Wingtips in the Palace. The publisher, fearing weak sales, pushed to get every conceivable keyword into the title, which leaves us where we are with this god-awful long title, but hopefully it'll get more people interested in it on Amazon. I also considered whether nation building was the right thing to put in the title, given the current environment and the kind of love-hate relationship that Americans have with nation building. But at the end of the day, I talked to Jim Dobbins about it, and he said, look, there's just nothing else to call it. You can rebrand a root canal, a tooth procedure, but it's still a root canal. So the question I have throughout is, how do we do it better? If I convince people that we need to do it at all, how do we do it better? It covers a number of different places where I've served in a number of different capacities and with a number of different rationales. They're very different countries with very different problem sets, but the one thing they had in common was that the United States considered how they were governed to be important to the U.S. national interest and sent people and resources to try to improve it. And that sounds wildly arrogant. I know in today's day, among today's issues, we feel that's an arrogant way of putting it. But if you consider terrorism, militarism, genocide, communism, and man-induced famine as the factors that we were attacking, I would say that they do create a more threatening environment for the United States, and in some cases were just offensive to our sensibilities. So some of these cases were military intervention. Some of them were supporting a beleaguered government. Many of them were very indirect. They were not the result of an intervention. But I would suggest also that many of the lessons learned also have to do with the very day-to-day work that embassies do across the world. That there's a lot of these lessons that are embedded in the work that country teams do on a day-to-day basis. So what is nation building? Now, this is my definition. I hope it works, but I was trying to work through the whole question of what a nation state is and how this came to be this very contentious issue. But I would say that a nation is the result of a political compact that unites the people of a certain territory under a single identity. So this is the sort of blood and belonging, as Michael Ignatieff calls it. The state, rather, is the institutions that manage the business of governing within that nation. More bureaucratic in nature. Do I have running water, security, an electoral process that works? There's places like Yugoslavia that had decent state institutions, but fell apart as a nation. And Somalia was basically a nation without a state. But nation states, an effective nation state blends the two together. This comes out of the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, where nation states were created as the main instrument of international order after 30 years of murder and mayhem across Germany and Europe. And it actually evolved, as I read it, into a hyper-Westphalian system in the Cold War, when the United States and Russia were running around creating nation states out of places that probably had no business being nation states. We're now moving into this kind of post-Westphalian period, and that makes it, comes with its own set of challenges, but where we've got corporations that are now richer than states and terrorist groups that can attack states, while we, in our own nation state, dabble with the fantasies that come from a weakened nation state. The right-hand picture there is an interesting one. It's actually a very current picture. I didn't have one from when I was there. But in 1994, I went to the San Salvador Zoo with a group of youth that I mentored in our church group. And one of these guys was just funny by nature, as most Salvadorans frankly are. And he sees this bear that has all the fat kind of burned off his body. He's this skinny bear, and he realizes, you know, the zoo doesn't even have enough resources to feed the animals. So he just had this phrase that I've never forgotten. He just looked at me and said, "Este país no sirve." This country just doesn't function. Now, I thought he could have been more patient. They had just come out of a long civil war. They had a whole lot of other things to worry about. I'm sure feeding the animals in the zoo wasn't one of them. But we do find that 25 years later, 40% of the country is still wanting to leave El Salvador. I would say that at the end of the day, for migration, for pandemics, for terrorism, for a whole lot of things, strong and capable nation states matter. So I've got 10 principles that I've developed from my experience that I would say are the things we need to focus on as we work to strengthen nation states in different places. The first one is to get the political compact that defines the nation right. And what I found is if you don't do that, nothing else is going to work. There's no way to fight your way out of a bad political compact. There's no way to buy your way out of it. That really is the first step to any functional nation state. We often hear people talk about nation building, and they'll say, yeah, we want to do more nation building at home. And I think what I interpret is they're saying, let's bring all these resources back to the United States and build our infrastructure. And people are thinking just in terms of the stuff that you would build. But I would say that the construction of the stuff is the easy part of it. The hard part is the political compact that governs the nation and a narrative that the citizens of that nation embrace. Now, some of what we were involved in my career was picking up the pieces of imposed narratives and compacts that had broken down. The fall of communism brought all sorts of issues across Eastern Europe. The breakup of artificially designed states like Iraq and Yugoslavia were incredibly complicated, and some had to do with sort of unfair economic models. Those were, in my opinion, in some ways easier in a place like El Salvador and Colombia, where the fight was over socioeconomic models and justice by people that still shared a common vision and ethnicity. Iraq and Afghanistan were difficult, and they were always going to be difficult. There was the question of whether they would be a monarchy. Would they be an Islamic republic? Would they be a modern democracy? Or would they split up altogether? Somalia, I thought, was even more difficult. It wasn't even sure it wanted to be a nation at all, and that was kind of a 20-year process to get to a point where they really valued being a nation at all. One of the things that intrigued me, I have to say, was the question of the Loya Jirga in Afghanistan, because one thing that I tried to figure out was what is the natural mechanism for countries to come to a point where they have got a process that they can help to cohere the nation. And I was in Afghanistan in 2002 for the first Loya Jirga. It was an intriguing process to me. It was UN supported, but Afghan led and Afghan managed for the most part. 1,700 delegates come in from all over the country. UN teams went around to help the villages select them, send the teams in. Women were represented as never before. The Germans had actually brought in a gigantic Oktoberfest tent because there was no building in Kabul large enough to hold the delegates. It was this mini peace and reconciliation process as the Afghans were able to vent and express themselves and all that. So they had the short-term piece of it was validating Karzai in the cabinet. There were big pieces of it that were missing. The Taliban was not there, and it was seen in some ways as a loss for the Pashtuns. So there was still a lot of things to be sorted out. But as a process, it was quite intriguing, and of course it is the same process they go back to over and over again. It bought some time, and it gave us some stability that could have probably turned out better if we had focused a little bit more up front in the follow-up. Second is to follow the political compact with the quick building of diversely skilled and wide-ranging security forces. And I pack all those words in there because there's a whole lot of pieces to this that we often ignore. It's something we do a lot of. We don't necessarily do it all that well. Security is in my reading, supportive of stability, but not the main driver of it. You can't really fight your way out of a bad political arrangement. But a small number of spoilers, if not contained, can crash an otherwise good political arrangement. I thought we did this relatively well in El Salvador, but it wasn't really sustained. The top picture on the right is I was an advisor to the Salvadoran OCS program at Fort Benning, where we trained the new cadre of officers that was going to go down and shore up the Salvadoran army. I then was posted to El Salvador 10 years later in 1994 and got together with these guys that had been through the war and then come out into peace on the other end. And it was actually quite, I thought, inspiring in the sense that they had stayed completely out of politics, which was a first for Salvadoran military officers. Their human rights record was very imperfect, but better than when we started. So there was a lot of things that did come together there. The gold standard is probably Colombia. That was where we probably had the most comprehensive blend of civilian and military efforts, good funding, and stayed the course. For some reason, by the time we got to Afghanistan and Iraq, we seem to have forgotten an awful lot of this. The battalion of Afghans on the left is the first battalion of Afghans that were trained in 2002. We essentially sent a Special Forces B team to start training the entire Afghan army. It was a very limited effort and left huge gaps, which then led to a lot of other issues. So there's a lot to this, but the other part of it is judges or a judicial system in prison, which we often neglect. So the third thing is the economy, and there's a lot of different angles to this, but I wanted to hit just a couple of them. Again, you can't fight your way out of a bad agreement. You also can't buy your way out of it. But just like security, economics does have a play in building stability in a struggling state. So there's two cases that I wanted to mention. The first was Haiti. In 1996, we had restored democracy to Haiti. We came back in 1994, so we brought Aristide back. He finished out his term. He then turns over to Preval. In 1996, there begins this power struggle between the two of them, and it was basically a power struggle over what kind of economic model to follow. Now, being the good capitalists that we are, we insisted that any aid would be conditioned on their adoption of a neoliberal framework. To us, that was very transactional. If you want assistance, you need to adopt this kind of a framework. That should be a no-brainer. It's a ton of money. Why would you accept it? But to them, the transaction was very complicated because that assistance, it didn't necessarily go where they thought it should. It didn't necessarily, in the short term, produce the jobs that they were so worried about. So they were actually hesitant about that. Aristide forms another party, and he starts a rearguard action against the government in which he draws away a lot of the people, and we just get this place where we're stuck. There was a number of prominent Americans that were actually in favor, not of what Aristide was doing, but certainly of more patience on our part in how fast we moved them towards this new liberalized economic framework. Robert Oakley was on that, and Don Schultz from the War College. In the end, the parliament was fractured. They left $500 million on the table that they just could not receive because they couldn't get to the agreement that we insisted on. In Iraq, we had similar kinds of discussions around the table with the Coalition Provisional Authority every month. And I remember some of these got so heated. There was one time a senior Pentagon official running the economic policy was told by a two-star general in the field, if you don't believe me about how bad things are, I want you to come walk patrol with me in Mosul. And the answer was, I'll come walk patrol with you any day of the week, and I won't even wear a vest. Anyway, it was this very heated issue about whether jobs were inducers of stability, or whether if you create stability, the jobs will follow. We had this chicken and egg thing, and I was always told if it's a chicken and egg thing, it's better to be the chicken. It never really worked out in Iraq either. We never quite got that model right. But there was, I thought, a good academic study of this by Roland Paris. And his thing was 3 words. He called it institutionalization before liberalization. And he was going back to the Hungarian model, where he said, look, in Hungary, when they transitioned from communism to capitalism, they went a full 4 years where the economy was largely left alone. Jobs were still status jobs. Factories were still allowed to remain open, even though they weren't that productive. Institutionalization before liberalization. So he said, let's get the political piece settled and then move on to some of this other harder stuff in the economy. No right answer to this. Short term of jobs versus long term of good policy is going to be a debate for a long time. But I think we need to be cognizant that if we get the order wrong, there is a place where we lose the very political stability that we most need for any of this stuff to work. 4th is about potential spoilers. The losers in any agreement are going to need a home. It's kind of stunning to me that at the height of the insurgency, El Salvador had 9,000 insurgents. It now has 60,000 gang members. I was mentored in the Salvadoran case by Colonel Reynaldo Garcia. He was a survivor of the Bay of Pigs operation, Cuban-born, really feisty officer in the U.S. Army that had developed this very elaborate system for ensuring that we could basically outbid the insurgents. And he saw this as in many ways very transactional, less ideological, more transactional. When I was in Mexico working on containing the violence in Ciudad Juarez, I was up there one time and I talked to the mayor about the gang members, and that was when Juarez was the fulcrum of the drug violence in Mexico. 1/4 of all killings in Mexico were in Juarez, and killings across the country were at an all-time high. So he said, you know, I went to a gas station and I came across all these gang members, and I asked them, I said, why do you guys do what you do? He said, you know you're going to be dead in a year. And one guy, he says, channeling his best Zapata, said, it's better to live a year on your feet than a lifetime on your knees. I thought about that a lot. There are these guys that just need something to do, and you almost have to outbid them and find a place for them in order to get them out of the way so that the rest of it can all work. Number 5, all peace is local. And I rely here a little bit, actually a lot, on the research of Oliver Kaplan, a very good academic from the University of Denver that was with me at USIP the first time I was there. He points out that in the Colombia case, and this is probably the one where it was the most complicated, that whatever grand schemes we have nationally and regionally, and however they play out, whatever government comes into power, citizens will only support it if there are local issues are part of that equation. So peace in many of these cases must be reinforced village by village by village. And if they don't, then it unravels the whole plan. And his book, Resisting War, is a very good account of how that was done in Colombia. Still needs to be followed up, of course, in the future. But to get to the peace, there was an awful lot of local work that had to support the national compact that came through. Number 6, I also rely on someone else for this. That's Rufus Phillips, whose Why Vietnam Matters, I think, is really the book that has this the clearest. Rufus is a living link all the way back to Lansdale in the 50s, where he started work in Southeast Asia and then followed it through to the end of the Vietnam War. But one of the things that he said about Vietnam that I thought was spot on, and I think a lot of us have experienced this in many places: the official American view of the war missed the single most influential component, a South Vietnamese political cause worth fighting for, while the enemy, the Viet Cong, framed every action as furthering its political cause against colonialism and feudalism and for unification. My partner in Al Anbar in 2003 and 4 was Governor Abdul Karim Barjas. He was a very clever guy, former police chief, very balanced in his relations with everybody. He got along with everybody. I'd often see these wild-eyed sheikhs in his office, and he would kind of smile and say, you know, I'd rather have them in my office than outside where I don't know what they're doing. So he had a very good relationship built up with everybody. One of the things he used to always tell me when I'd see a problem that I just couldn't figure out, he'd just say, leave that to me. He said, to every problem, there is an Iraqi solution. And I said, okay, that sounds pretty good to me. Anyway, his Iraqi solution at that time, and it's not clear this would have worked, but it certainly is something to consider. And it has, you know, kind of haunted us, I think, ever since, how we approach the issues of security and governance in Iraq. But he said, you know, you really ought to consider the British model in the 1920s, where they decamped from the cities. They left the cities in Iraqi security force control. They went out to the countryside, built cantonments so that they were close enough that they could respond if necessary, but meanwhile, they were not in the face of the Iraqis day to day. It's a balancing act. It's not always hard and not always easy to get right. I would say we've done it largely right in El Salvador and Colombia, where we allowed the governments to retain that nationalist card, to not look like the stooges of outsiders. And I think we struggle with that a lot more in Afghanistan and Iraq. They're very different cases, but I would say we probably could have been more sensitive to that in some of the later cases that we were involved in. Number 7, nation building is a very long game. We really need to pace ourselves. There was a British commentator once that said that in the development of the rule of law, the first 500 years are always the hardest. We might not need 500 years, but we certainly need more than 6 months. And we really can't plan in 6-month increments. Lockhart and McCloskey said, any international actor that wants to help build a state must be in it for the long haul, with modest expectations for short-term benchmarks and no delusions about succeeding on the cheap. This is where, in many cases, the political process just simply intensifies, because there's some of these cases that take time. They take a long time for the political process to work out, and there's no way to accelerate that. It took time for the Haitians to realize that a charismatic but somewhat deranged leader was probably not the best thing to lead their country. They went through 2 terms of Aristide before they figured that out, but they figured that out now. It took time for the Iraqi Shia to realize they couldn't dominate the Sunnis the way the Sunnis had dominated them for decades. They have learned that now. The country has somehow miraculously survived and is edging forward. And it took time for Somalia to really decide that it valued nationhood at all. In 1991, Somalia collapses as a state, first collapse of a state really in modern times, and the state that has remained without a government for the longest period in modern history. In the spring of 1994, I was with the UN, and we put together the Nairobi Accords, which brought warlords, faction leaders, clan leaders to Nairobi to try to edge out an accord and buy some stability. We succeeded at that. It bought kind of a few years of stability, not a national government, but at least a national accord. The Western powers then pull out in the spring of 1994, leaving only third world UN forces on the ground and a very small political mission. And then Somalia kind of drops off the map for most of the large countries that had been there so enthusiastically the year prior. But it just edges along. Bosaso, the port of Bosaso got built out. A lot of private sector money starts coming in. They went through a long period of having to fight Al-Shabaab. During the war on terror, we go back in with some resources and assistance. Political work continues to edge along with the UN and different US and European initiatives. And 2 decades later, Somalia finally forms a government, which Secretary Clinton recognized in January 2013. It was a very long process. I don't know that there was a faster way to do it. There may have been. We certainly didn't do everything right. but it was something that probably had to play out over at least a somewhat long period of time. Kyle Weston, one of my colleagues, said this stuff is a marathon, not a sprint, and the United States often tends to get winded. The eighth one, I would just, there's the whole slide here. All right, there is a slide here, number 8, which I've missed, but it's about the artificial divide between soft and hard power. So soft and hard power is something that that comes up a good deal. In 2017, when Mick Mulvaney, then director of OMB, rolled out the new budget, he was true to what the president had campaigned on, no more Mr. Nice Guy. He said, there's no question that this is a hard power budget. This is not a soft power budget. We want to send a message to our allies and our potential adversaries that this is a strong power administration. So you've seen money move from soft power programs, from foreign aid, into more hard power programs. Hard power equals strong power. Congress at the time said bollocks to this and restored much of what had been taken out, but it still left us with many diminished tools that had been useful on the what is known as soft power side, but what I would call full spectrum power. If you look at the speech that Ronald Reagan gave on Central America in March of 1983, he listed out security assistance, economic aid, land reform, political reform, and human rights as critical to the achievement of the overall U.S. objective of building a functional state that could outbid the communist cause that we were pitted against. Lindsey Graham also gets this well. He said in June 2017 at USIP, only a combination of hard and soft power will stabilize the backyards of key countries, which in turn will be the key to making our own backyard safer. Full spectrum power, I would call it, and I would really not advocate that game between soft and hard. Number 9, leadership matters. On our side, we tend to make these assignments often as if it were just another posting. From my experience, there really is kind of a certain kind of person that can manage well in these missions, a certain amount of experience, empathy, a willingness to operate in the gray zone, often somebody outside the mainstream. The UN, I think, often has these people in some ways more than we do, just because they have people out in the field for longer. They can post them to places for 3, 4, 5 years. On the other side, the host countries, we have less control. Sometimes we get lucky, as we did with President Santos in Colombia. I would argue with the early President Karzai. Sometimes we need to just wait things out and wait until the leaders arise on their side. But leadership is something that definitely matters on both sides. And 10, don't be afraid of the gray zone. Switzerland is really not the goal. I think we often go into these things and we get frustrated because we finish what we think was a good level of effort, and we don't have Switzerland in the process. There's a real gray area to these that I think we have a hard time adapting to. And I look at it in terms of the mythology that came out of the Second World War, where we got very accustomed to the total victory, total defeat model. And I think we've had a hard time adapting to everything that's followed that. And I think it's even getting worse now, where that model is almost without relevance. I think of Dostum in Mazar. I had a relationship with Marshal Dostum in Jowzjan when I was posted to Mazar in 2012 and 13, and he told me stories about the war and Shebregan prison and all the rest. And it was if you look at it closely, it was a very, very convoluted process. He was talking to his Taliban counterparts pretty much the whole time they were fighting. So it's this long process of fighting, talking, capturing some people, defeating them, switching sides, fighting some more, talking some more. It's a very uncategorical form of conflict. The Darfur rebels were another one that I found that we never quite got a good handle on what we were up against and how gray it was that it was going to play out. But we had the objective in the early 2000s to stop a genocide by the government of Sudan against the people of Darfur. We largely achieved that through sanctions, international pressure, reinforced with a peacekeeping mission across Darfur. We had succeeded in the initial objectives, but consolidating those objectives was where it got really difficult. So we supported the AU and ultimately the UN in a peacekeeping mission. It was very mixed success in terms of how that turned out, but there was also some political work. But it was a very tough case. Mini Manawi was the one rebel leader that made peace during the Darfur peace agreement in 2004. He comes out of the field and is now functioning as a political party. The other groups that didn't make peace then needed to be brought into a united bloc so that all the rebel groups were able to function together in their negotiations with the Khartoum government. That was a very difficult task. It never actually quite worked out. At one point, I found that we had more in common with the Khartoum government we were opposing than we did with the rebel groups that we were supposed to be supporting. It was a very, very gray area, and it was something that was going to, again, play out over a long period of time. But in the end, we did stop the genocide. So let me just conclude with a couple of thoughts on, when I started writing this, it didn't occur to me that it would have relevance to our own situation, but I do have some thoughts on our current situation in the United States, and I've started a second book called How to Have a Civil War that relies on some of these cases and others to look at the situation that we find ourselves in. So I sketched out kind of the things that, as I read these different conflicts, what are the things that drove them into conflict. And the first was to widen inequality and ignore citizens' aspirations for a viable economic future. Adolfo Gillies said of the Salvadoran conflict, the war's purpose was not complex. It was to decide whether a very few could continue to dominate the many. Second, weaken institutions. Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson note, for a generation, the capacity of the United States to harness governmental authority for broad public purposes has been in steep decline, even as the need for effective governance in a complex, interdependent world has grown. Third, tribalize your country. America's tribal segmentation to me is no less confusing than that of the Somalis. It now involves race, gender, religion, class, geography, and for many, just strictly channeling through political party identification. The tendency to polarizing populism is probably the most disturbing. There's a parallel to some of these cases, but none are frankly about populism. They're grounded in much more basic issues. It's almost like we have the luxury as an advanced country to dabble in some of these things that others, again, focus on much more basic things. And fourth, weaponize the airwaves. George Packer suggests that we're living with a kind of new regime that didn't exist in Orwell's time. It combines hard nationalism, the diversion of frustration and cynicism into xenophobia and hatred, with soft distraction and confusion, a blend of Orwell and Huxley, cruelty and entertainment. So let me just close with a tribute to those that I knew, which were not a lot, but were enough, that paid the price for some of what we have done abroad. Anne Smedinghoff was my intern several years before her death in Afghanistan. I was very shaken by her death. I was there when she passed away, was killed. And Dinesh Rajwandari was one of my troopers in the 82nd and lost his life in Grenada. Extraordinary Americans, extraordinary young Americans that were willing to serve their country and in the end gave their lives for causes which we had embraced as a country and which I would argue were noble causes that had every the support that should have continued support from us as a people. So I hope that as we learn to do these things better, we honor those that have paid the price for what we have gone out to do. Well, thank you very much. That was a pleasure, and I think we're ready for questions.
Okay, Keith, we have a question from Robert Bentley. He asks, Keith, you mentioned that we seem not to have learned the lessons of relative successes in El Salvador and Colombia when it came to Afghanistan and Iraq. And why do you think that is?
So there are big differences in the Afghanistan and Iraq cases. It was a more immediate situation. We had to go more militarily into these countries to do what we had set our sights on doing. So there was a difference in that sense. El Salvador and Colombia, we could do them more indirectly because there wasn't an immediate threat to our country. So however we interpret the Iraqi threat, but at the time it was sold as an immediate threat, and Afghanistan certainly was because we had just been attacked. So I would say that they were more difficult cases. But even in that context, I think we missed some of the lessons learned. Part of that, I think, was probably just the people that have been doing these things were, on the military side, certainly were in a different part of the world, and we didn't necessarily make that knowledge transfer into the new theaters. Part of it, there was an arrogance, I think, about hubris about what would happen or could happen with these countries that we had liberated, if you will. There was an assumption that things would somehow just work out that was not really grounded in the reality that many people would have suggested. So our knowledge transfer, I think, is lacking. And then again, just ignoring some of the lessons that certainly on the diplomatic side were being offered, but were not readily embraced.
Picking up a bit on that point, we do have another question regarding sort of the hubris, maybe as a follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain, what do you think gives the U.S. The right and the credibility to actively lead nation-building efforts? It goes to that point about credibility. We'd be interested in your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. So the question of the right is, in these cases, we had a rationale for, in each case, for doing what we did. I've laid that all out in the book, and maybe they're convincing, maybe they're not, but they were not done haphazardly. They weren't done without a real sense of national interest that led us to want to change how these nations were governed was essentially what it came down to. So the right, I think, is one that has to be taken into account case by case. I will say that I came back from Grenada after the intervention there, and I found myself at Berkeley. I was looking at graduate schools and got to Berkeley, and the political science department, there was a big banner up that led "Get U.S. Forces Out of Grenada." I realized that probably wasn't the place for me, but I found that there was a sense of, this just wasn't morally or legally acceptable. The British actually were very hard on us for that. Maggie Thatcher thought it was a very misguided operation. But having seen it on the ground, where there was euphoria over having cast off what was essentially a government of thugs that had been mistreating the people, it was really to them quite compelling what had happened, and they saw it as something that was the right thing to do morally, regardless of whatever legal case there might have been. On the harder cases, Afghanistan and Iraq, again, that's a question of national interest, how we interpret that, and then how we channel that. On the credibility question, I think it is a good one, and I would argue that in most cases we're better trying to channel these things through the UN, which in many cases simply does them better, has better staying power, and comes in with an international framework. Not always possible, and certainly with the Security Council the way it is now, it's harder, but in many cases, peacekeeping missions led by the UN have both better chance of success and more credibility up front.
Thank you. We do have another question from Richard Olson, a good one. You ask, I think he asks in particular, you identify a political compact as the first step of this. We're wondering, what if the political compact does not take? What does the U.S. do at that point? And at what point do you have to pull the plug? If it leads to authoritarianism or something of that nature.
Right. Very good question. I would, Rick, you've done more of this than I have, but I'll offer my thoughts. I would say that we're helped if we can set it up in a way that is sustainable. That's the first thing I would say, is that we often set these things up as very dramatic, all or nothing, do or die situations. And I think we need to recognize up front that they are going to need longer to play out. And, that was the Haiti case was a classic. It took a couple of decades, as did Somalia. And we were very messianic, I think, when we went into Somalia. We were running around the country with political kits for mayors and stuff like that. I mean, we just really thought it was going to take immediately. It was going to be a much longer case than that. So I don't think we always channel things through their cultural context. I think if we can do it in a way that's a little bit more humble and modest, it often will have a better chance of being sustainable through the ups and downs. I would say pulling the plug, what I always say is, just because we lose interest in a country of 30 million people that has been threatening before or is facing a famine doesn't mean it goes away. It just means that we've lost interest. And I think in many of these cases, we do need to sustain interest at some level over a longer period of time. And again, a lot of these we have gone in very dramatically, left very dramatically, and then continued on trying to get to that political pact that would finally work. I also think there's often neighbors that can be helpful. The Balkans were certainly helped by being on the edge of the EU. So I think there's a lot of other tools that we don't always engage, and often those tools don't have much to do with the United States. So pulling the plug, I would be reluctant to do in a country that we have an interest in, but I do think we can be, again, more modest about how we do it and get to a sustainable level that we can continue until the conditions come together, the right leader emerges, the right situation comes about in that country where it's going to come together.
Well, there is a follow-on really on that line, is that how do we edge like newly built states away from authoritarianism and towards liberalism? The question is that something that you would say just takes time? And we look at maybe Taiwan or South Korea as cases. What are your thoughts about that process?
So I guess the way I experienced it, I would say that the gold standard for stability is always going to be a fully democratic regime, because I just think people's aspirations can't be channeled and cared for any other way. So I think that should always be what we're shooting for. From chaos or a completely failed or fractured state to move through a period of illiberal democracy or even authoritarianism, I don't think that's so bad, and I think we need to be patient with it. That kind of goes back to the Jeane Kirkpatrick's writings during the Cold War, that a right-wing regime is better than a left-wing regime, because right-wing regimes eventually go away, left-wing regimes get entrenched, which seems to be what has played out, of course, in Cuba and elsewhere. So I think that being realistic about the local situation, not overplaying something that is going to take longer, and allowing for, again, those local conditions in a way that would at least induce stability. I think that the Libya case is one where it's a cautionary tale for trying too hard, too fast to unseat an authoritarian can actually make things worse. I think there are cases where we're better off letting something play out over a longer period of time rather than trying to jump right into a full-on democratic framework that the country's not ready for.
No, thank you. We do have another question from Will Shu Lenshao, a good one. And how do you see the digital age influencing nation building? And will it be, do you think, for the better or for the worse?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, the thing that I found across all these different places was that I think the real driver of change is youth. And youth, I found, are coming alive across the Middle East, across Africa, across the world, and I think they're looking for that outlet. How do they channel their aspirations? And I think they're the ones that are by far more attuned to social media, digital tools. That is their life, and I think they're looking for channeling their energies in a positive way. It's a huge leap forward in many societies. I found when I got to Iraq, I had a very good translator, and we were talking the first day, and I was trying to get a sense for who was who and the local tribes and everything. And I said, well, who's your sheikh? And he looked at me, and with all the energy he could muster in a language not his own, he just said, Mr. Keith, I am my own sheikh. I thought that was pretty clear. He did know who his sheikh was, though, at the end of the day. So he was in that place where they were ready for an active civil society. They wanted a different society. They wanted education. They wanted travel. They had these aspirations. It was still going to take time to get past the power structure that existed. But I think the digital side of that for them is really spot on. Afghanistan, I found the same thing. The youth, there is a huge youth bulge there right now, of course. They're very youthful societies, and they are just kind of waiting for when it's their turn and how they get involved. So that part of it, I think, makes everything easier. I guess the flip side of that is you get a lot of the negatives that take off immediately, and there's not a hedge for some of the mistakes that will invariably be made, and also, of course, a digital way of leading people in a certain direction. ISIS was very clever with their social media, for example. There's some other negatives that come out of that as well. But I would say overall, generally good.
We have time for another few questions. We did get another one in that I'd like to relay. Given the domestic political volatility of committing hard power to foreign issues, spanning from the charges of enacting neo-colonial interests to a strong negative reaction to the loss of U.S. personnel, for example, to foreign conflicts, do you think there are any troubling implications of committing largely, symbolic or extremely limited military force in order to balance out the soft-hard spectrum?
Yeah, that's a great question. I came out of the Special Forces community when I was in the military, and then I retained a relationship with them in the reserves for 20 years. I mean, I do think that we have forces that are very skilled at applying what I would call soft hard power. So they're in the military, but they're not fighting. They're advising. They're building the ministries of defense, the capacity, the leadership, and things like that. And that is something that, again, I think we could probably do better. But we have a lot of people that do it well now. And if you look at the Sahel of Africa, for example, what the French are doing in, again, building security forces, building the capacity to do the hard power in those countries, but without actual direct military intervention. I guess the French are militarily vested in that as well, but again, mostly trying to shore up the local forces. I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. Again, in Afghanistan and Iraq, we just didn't do that well, and I'm really not sure why. We did not go in early to try to build the forces that would have then got us in the background quicker. So I think that committing hard power, but in an indirect way, I think is really the model that we need to do. We can do effectively, and we can do it with very few casualties. So I think that's something that we can do. Again, we've got to go in and do all the other stuff too, because if there's not a justice system, if there's not a prison system, if there's not all the other components of it, police and everything else, then the military alone is not going to be enough. And that's the hard part that we do very slowly and very ploddingly, and we don't really have a capacity to surge.
We have a good question from Rachel Rickert, who asks, given the need for long-term commitments in nation building, how do you ensure those commitments are kept, given the political system that prioritizes immediate solutions, short-term thinking, and perhaps in this case, this is geared toward the United States. I mean, if you could talk a little bit about how that process plays out domestically.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that it would be nice if this issue could be depoliticized. It would be nice if it were one of those things that we could kind of get to a point where it's not an issue that people would run against. I mean, you can't tell people what to run for or against, but if we could get to that point where politicians didn't feel like this was an easy target. It's an easy target to beat up on the UN. It's an easy target to beat up on nation building, and we're not going to have soldiers walking little kids to school and all this sort of thing that came up during the campaign of 2000 by the administration that then went on to conduct the two biggest nation building operations in our history. So it'd be nice just to get to a point of I would just call it political maturity, that we recognize that these are essential tasks on a certain level, at a certain cost, in a certain sustainable way, but that the mission of trying to strengthen states that are fragile and failing is something that is essential. Now, there is a framework for this now. There is an act on state fragility that we now have a government strategy and framework for this. And again, it's not messianic about going in and invading everybody and fixing their countries. It's very sustainable. It's all the range of tools that we have. So that's bipartisan. So that is something that I think is accepted by both parties as something that we need to do well, and we need to sustain it over time. So I think there's a level for these things that we can do well. The dramatic cases where things went wrong, we probably should have been more careful, and we probably should have thought about domestic blowback and the rest. I also do hope in my book to present a narrative that the total frustration we've had, and Iraq and Afghanistan are the two biggest ones, that I think that there is a lot of the criticism that is just unjustified, and I think is frankly unfair, that they were always going to be difficult cases. In Iraq, you know, the notion that we should have just never done it, I think is a little bit oversimplified. If you look at the threat they had been producing in the region, with or without the immediate issue of weapons of mass destruction, it was a country that was on the Security Council docket every single Security Council meeting from the Gulf War I, 91, all the way up until 9/11. So again, the intelligence was cooked. We all know that story, but independent of that, it had been a country that was threatening to the region and indirectly to us. So I think that, and having committed to that, again, a very long, painful process that was harder than it needed to be, harder on us, harder on them. We should have done it better, but at the end of the day, it's a nation that's still struggling forward, hanging together, hasn't broken apart, isn't Syria, isn't Libya. And I would argue that that we could kind of rise above some of the frustration and accept that as just one of the real hard cases that nonetheless has produced something that we can now look back on, and hopefully one day they'll turn a corner and we'll have a stable state there that is functional. But I think keeping it at a modest level, recognizing the importance of it, this pandemic, I'll tell you, if the pandemic doesn't wake people up to the importance of having functional nations. I wrote in the book about how during the bird flu, the avian bird flu, the avian flu, that Thailand had the mission of killing off 40 million chickens. I just raised the question, how do you kill 40 million chickens without a functional state? I wouldn't know where to start. So functional states, I think, really are the issue that we need to be cognizant of, and all these issues that we're struggling with: migration, pandemics, terrorism. All these things really come down to capable nation states that we can partner with to manage those locally.
Oh, thank you for that. I think we have time for. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I think we have one last question, and then we'll wrap up. I know it's lunchtime for others. So the question is, what are the main issues that you see, for the lack of a better word, anti-nation building scholars tend to get wrong?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would start with the role of the UN, and I would refer to Jim Dobbins' work from RAND on nation building. He's got a whole series of books out on the UN and nation building, the US and nation building, and basically does show that in general, the UN has a better track record than we do. So the anti-UN part of that, I think, is very damaging. I think it causes us to make things harder than they need to be because we just don't quite know what to do with the UN. So I would say that's one big thing. I would just say, again, in the general track record, there's an awful lot of successes, and he raises the issue in his book. I think it's after the Taliban book. He was at the NSC. We're trying to figure out what to do to shore up Afghanistan after the Loya Jirga and after the government has basically been restored. And he was arguing for a UN peacekeeping mission, which would have the political component, the peacekeeping troops for stabilization. And then the notion at the time was that never works. That's never worked. And he was just flabbergasted because he could, rattle off about a dozen cases where in fact it had worked. El Salvador, Mozambique, the Balkans. There's a whole series of places where it had been effective, some of them quite miraculously, frankly. So the fact that it doesn't work is kind of just the general assumption. I think you polled 100 Americans, you'd probably find 90 of them that would feel like it just never works, but it's just not accurate. It has worked. So the fact that it works at all. And then I think, again, not accepting that there is a procedure, there are components of this, and just kind of dismissing it out of hand rather than looking closely at the different pieces of the craft, and again, when it has gone well, how it's gone well, why it's gone well, and how we can do it better.
Keith, I want to take a moment to just thank you for your presentation, comprehensive, your insight. We see that the concept of nation building and these principles are very relevant, including here in our own country. So I really appreciate what you've shared with us today. And on behalf of the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. Thanks for joining us today. Before we go, I just want everyone to understand that this is one of what we hope will be several in a series of virtual, in this case, discussions where part of what we do at ADST is to capture, preserve, and share the experiences of America's diplomats. And this is the kind of discussion that can help do so. We're recording this and we'll make the link available. We'll upload it to the ADST YouTube channel. So stay tuned for that. But before, I want to throw it back to you, Keith, to close it out. Maybe just a word on how people can get your book as it's coming out, what you would recommend. And I just want to thank everyone for the time and for this great discussion. Back to you, Keith, to close it out.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks for joining. That was a lot of fun. The book's, I guess you can pre-order it on Amazon. It's supposed to be out in August. I haven't heard about any COVID-related delays, so I think it's ready to go. It's what else can I say? It's a great book. Hope you get it. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much for that. Thanks everyone for joining, and check out our resources at adst.com. Subscribe for our newsletter and join us to support the legacy of American diplomacy. Thanks again, Keith. We'll look forward to keeping in touch, and stay tuned for further announcements of the next diplomatic series. Have a great day, and thanks very much again.
Thanks, everybody.